explore 16,000 years of Virginia history. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture offers a variety of exhibitions, public programs, and special events for the whole family. Learn more and plan your visit at virginiahistory.org.
Welcome to Revolution Revisited, your crash course in the American Revolution. Dive into the stories of Virginia's rebels, rule breakers, and rabble-rousers who shaped a nation. This podcast is brought to you by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and made possible by William and Karen Fralin.
Welcome back to Revolution Revisited. I'm your host, Maggie Creech. In 1781, British troops occupied key coastal cities, including New York, Charleston, and Savannah, and the Royal Navy patrolled the Atlantic coastline. In May, General Lord Charles Cornwallis invaded Virginia from North Carolina. By August, his army was encamped along the York River at Yorktown and planned to establish a naval base there. But while he awaited supplies and reinforcements from the Royal Navy, the Continental Army seized an opportunity and surprised the British at Yorktown in a siege that would turn the world upside down. To examine the forces that came together at Yorktown, we're joined by...
My name is Iris de Rode. I'm a historian specialized in the French-American alliance of the American Revolution. I am Dutch by birth, but I grew up in France, and I live in Washington, D.C. now. I am a Gibson postdoctoral fellow at the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia. Then I'm involved in many other projects relating to French-American cooperations. I work with museums, documentaries, French embassy, and so we're doing many things relating to the French and the American Revolution.
While the Siege of Yorktown happened in the fall of 1781, what happened before is maybe even more important. The French and American decision to take Yorktown was a calculated one, based on months of reconnaissance, cooperation, and calculation. In May 1780, France sent the Comte de Rochambeau to North America with roughly 5,500 troops to support the Patriot cause as a part of the official alliance with the United States. Rochambeau was a seasoned French general with decades of military experience by the time he entered the American Revolution. He was instructed to serve with General Washington, and the two quickly developed a mutual respect. So now these somewhat freshly allied commanders, Washington and Rochambeau, had to figure out how, when, and where to deal a major blow to the British.
In September of 1780, when the first meeting happened, when Washington and Rochambeau had to make decisions on where are we going to attack the British. And two options were already set at that time, which was New York City or the South. They didn't know where in the South. They had, of course, no idea what would happen later in the summer of 1781, where the British would have been based then. But there was always this idea of there's two options for us from the beginning of their cooperation.
But bringing together the two armies, while actively waging a war, no less, was complicated, given the history between the two groups. Both the Patriots and the French could not afford for this alliance or this war to fail. Rochambeau turned to his top generals for a solution when they arrived. They would send out a team on an informational campaign, doing some reconnaissance on their new American allies to find common ground and understand the battlegrounds. To carry this out, Rochambeau sent Major General François Jean de Chastellux, a man whose full contribution to the revolutionary cause was largely lost to history until Dr. de Rode's discovery of a private family archive. Before we dive into his mission, let's hear from Dr. de Rode about this incredible archival discovery.
So the reason I've been studying the French-American alliance for several years now is that for me, it started with discovering the archive of François Jean de Chastellux, who was the major general serving under Rochambeau. Rochambeau had three sort of top generals around him. One of them was Chastellux. Chastellux was major general of the French army that came to America with Rochambeau, and he was part of a somewhat larger staff, but he was third in command of the entire French army. He has been completely forgotten today, and one of the reasons is that his archives were thought lost. All his papers were thought lost just in history, but I found it. I found the archive in actually his family castle in the Château de Chastellux, which is a castle where his family has been living for 1,000 years and still today inhabited by the descendants of the Chastellux family. And the reason that I got into this topic and actually found this archive was it's an interesting little story, but it's a personal story too, because I grew up in France, in Burgundy. And so we had a very large tree in the garden called a tulip poplar tree. And the legend went in the village that it was planted by the Marquis de Lafayette. And so growing up, I thought I'm living in this nice garden with this huge Lafayette tree, and everyone called it that way. And so anyway, one point when I was about 18, I read a biography on Lafayette and realized he had never been to Burgundy. So he had never planted the tree, and it was supposed to be planted after the American Revolution, so an American tree. And so digging a little bit in that story, I found it was actually his uncle, François de Chastellux, that had brought that tree to my garden in France. And that was actually from the American Revolution when he served in Yorktown. And after that, he had brought some American trees back, and one of them grew in my garden and so inspired my whole research. And when I found the name Chastellux in a local archive who was writing to the person living in my home in the 18th century, I didn't know who he was, but I did know there was a castle close by called the Château de Chastellux. And so I went to the Château de Chastellux just to see, is there any information on my tree? And that is when I met Philippe de Chastellux, the owner of the castle, who told me he had the same tree, same tulip poplar. And he said, but I know exactly what happened to this tree, because actually it was François Jean de Chastellux received it as a gift from George Washington. And he then brought it to his garden, planted it there, and gave a few to some local people around. So one of these trees ended up in my garden. And so this is how it all started for me, because I just wanted to know more about the tree and what all happened. And so when Philippe said that he had a family archive but never really went in, I was like, well, can we maybe have a little look to see if there's more about the tree? Okay, so we enter this archive tower, which is a beautiful tower. It has about 700 years of archive, so it's quite impressive, but also very overwhelming in its amounts of documents. But one of the particular collections was François Jean de Chastellux's collection. And actually, instead of just a few pages on this tree, I found 6,000 pages of his entire private paper collection, including about 2,000 pages on the American Revolution. And so because he was a major general, he kept all his notes, but also military reports, correspondence, and anything you can imagine, from maps to private notes on the American Revolution. And they included many letters of Washington himself, of Jefferson, of Franklin, of Adams, and they had all been unpublished and never seen by historians. And so that led me to start doing this research and trying to understand, what did this Chastellux do in his time? And so one of the things he did was being one of the generals of Yorktown. And so this is a long story to tell why I did this research on Chastellux, and especially on that French-American campaign in America.
Okay, so back to the plot.
François Jean de Chastellux, when he arrived in Newport, Rhode Island in 1780 with Rochambeau and the others, they realized very fast that they were in quite a complicated situation. The first problem was that the local population didn't trust them at all. They were very afraid of the French. They thought the French army was maybe there to invade them. They thought they might bring Catholicism with them while they were Protestant. There were a lot of prejudices and tension still from the fact they had fought against each other during the 7 Years' War. So that is just more than a decade before, but they were enemies before, and now here they were as allies. They were not welcomed well, and especially it was clear that the cooperation between a French and American army would be quite a challenge, because they were separated by language barriers, they were separated by cultural differences, social differences. You have to imagine most of these French officers, especially Chastellux, were from French aristocracy. They were very close to the French court. They were part of that. They were dressed accordingly. They would literally wear wigs, perfumes, and powder over their faces. And so for the Newport population, they were quite curious, to say the least. And then the other way around was that the French quite looked down upon, especially the American army, because it was a very young army. It was not that experienced. They didn't have the same rules of conduct as the French ones. And so there was a huge gap between the French and Americans on many levels, which made it hard for them to work together. And Chastellux saw that from very close by, and he realized, if we don't change our relationship, it might become really hard for us to work together. And so in order to change the prejudices and the problems, the social, cultural, religious, all these issues, he decided and suggested to Rochambeau, what about I go travel with several French officers and we're going to meet a lot of the American officers, but also politicians, traders, scientists, local population, everyone we can imagine, just to try to understand these people better, but also understand what could bind us besides from we're going to fight together for a common goal, which is defeating the British. And this is when Chastellux becomes a crucial figure in this effort to improve these relationships and to cement the different relationships that are part of this alliance.
One of his first steps is to go meet George Washington himself.
Chastellux is the uncle of the Marquis de Lafayette. And so the Marquis de Lafayette is very close to George Washington already. He had arrived in 1777 and then become a sort of son-like figure to Washington. And so when Chastellux told his nephew, can you please introduce me? He was very happy to do so. Chastellux was about to meet Washington on his trip to go to see America and understand the revolution and understand its people. And when he met George Washington, for him was a real turning point. He arrived, it was the Day Mansion in New Jersey, where Washington was staying at his headquarters in the winter of 1780. And when Chastellux arrived with his entourage of his aides and some officers, Lafayette introduced him to Washington, and he was supposed to stay just a few hours, but he actually stayed 5 days because they got along so well. And he describes this, Chastellux, in a travel diary as well as in some letters, that he felt very much at ease with what he calls the greatest man of all. He was impressed by Washington. But what's interesting too is Washington was very impressed by Chastellux himself. They found a lot of things in common, including interests in, of course, warfare, their main common passion because they were in the middle of their war. But they were also really interested in enlightened thoughts on political future of the American Revolution, republicanism, what is democracy, what are we doing here during the Revolution. But they were also really bound by their interest in agriculture, in scientific experiments, in opera, theater, music. So actually everything you can imagine bound these two men. And especially also some more personal stories, such as the fact they had both lost their fathers young, they had lost brothers young, they were the youngest son of their own family, so they had to fight hard, let's say, to get money, all these different things. François-Jean Chastellux was a general, but he was also a philosopher of the Enlightenment. So Chastellux, being a philosopher of the Enlightenment, made him connected to two different worlds of the American Revolution. We have the military world with George Washington, where he was general, but you, of course, also have the intellectual world of the political debates that were happening at the time and the experiment that was the revolution to create a republic. And he was also very much involved in all these debates and discussions. And so he played a dual role of both the philosopher and the soldier. And so I think that makes him an interesting figure to study, but it also explains why he and Washington got along so well, because they were both really interested in both of these goals. You can really see a bond to be developing from that moment onwards. And during the war, they would meet very often. And Washington and Chastellux would have a friendship that Washington would refer to in a letter as a very deep and lasting friendship that neither time nor distance could ever eradicate. And then he would also say to Chastellux that never in my life did I meet with a man to whom my soul clave more sincerely than it did to yours. It's a special sentence, but it does really kind of allude to a soulmate relationship, right? So from the first meeting onwards, they would meet frequently. And over the course of the winter and especially summer of 1781, because of this trust between the two men, Washington would listen quite a lot to Chastellux in his advice. Chastellux was not the only advisor here. There were other Frenchmen that were also part of this. But the important part here is Chastellux and Washington could speak together directly because Chastellux spoke English very well. And on top of that, Washington really trusted his advice because based on all these different levels. And so this is a beginning of that trust building where Washington and Chastellux start to get along well. But from then onwards, other officers started to join. And so that distrust and the problems that these two armies had would start to fade away over that winter. And that is really something that is quite unknown by historians, but by looking at the private papers of Chastellux that are kept in that archive tower that I mentioned, you can really understand that that is a very crucial moment, actually, that's relationship building throughout that winter. As for his role in Yorktown, he was a major general, which meant he was mainly in charge of logistical details as well as strategy preparations. But he was also the only person of his rank that could speak English very well. And so he became a liaison between Rochambeau and Washington when they needed to talk to each other. He was the interpreter, and not just an interpreter, he became one of the main advisors of the discussions that they would have.
At first, Washington hoped to retake New York City, since it was the center of British operations. And it may have been, in part, because it was also the city he had lost, and his ego was somewhat tied up in it. Either way, after discussions with the French, including Chastellux, the strategy shifted.
At the time, the French and American officers, and especially the soldiers, were based in New York. They were based close to Manhattan, close to the British fortifications there, because they had been observing and thinking, are we going to attack it here or not? And so in September 1780, Chastellux became one of the advisors and very early on said, let's absolutely not go to New York. Let's please go to the south, because that seems much better. He knew that because he had been studying war for many years. He had been fighting in the 7 Years' War. He had a lot of experience, but he also, the winter of 1780 and 81, he did a lot of research to figure out what the French could do. So he traveled almost through all the states and observed all the different options they might have for battles, for attacks, for provisioning, for everything you can imagine. And so that preparation winter was very important for then conducting that campaign in 1781.
In short, Rochambeau's trust exercise paid off, sending Chastellux on this reconnaissance mission to really understand the people, what's already happened, what worked, what didn't, and then compile all of this data, did bring these allies closer together.
And so in the summer of 1781, they decided that they would go to the south. And in the middle of August 1781, it became clear that place would become Yorktown.
The prowess of the British Navy was one of the biggest barriers to American victory, and it would be impossible to wage this war without a strong naval front. Realizing this, Rochambeau requested additional naval support, and the French fleet was soon dispatched for a coordinated campaign on land and sea. Their sights were set on the Chesapeake Bay.
The Chesapeake Bay has already been identified by French and others that it would be a perfect way to block, because it has a particular shape that you can quite easily, if you put a line of several ships down, you can sort of close off that entire mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, right? And so the Comte de Grasse is sent by the French King Louis XVI to support the North American campaign of Rochambeau and Washington.
The arrival of the French fleet would mean two things. They'd have a robust naval component to counteract the British and interrupt their movements. And that fleet could bring with it money and men to reinforce a campaign on land. In August 1781, Washington gets word that Admiral de Grasse is going to sail for the Chesapeake. It's game on. They're going to Yorktown. The idea was that if de Grasse could control the bay, Washington and Rochambeau's armies could put enough pressure on Cornwallis to surrender. At least, they hope so. Washington, Rochambeau, and their combined army of 9,000 men set off to Virginia by foot.
The French and American troops started to march all the way to Yorktown. And so this is in summer of 1781. It's in the end of August that they start to move all the different units and the different marching orders of different columns, because we're talking about around 9,000 men. So you have to imagine they're not marching all at the same time. They're marching in different columns down on the often non-existing roads down in Virginia in the very intense summer heat that we might still know today, that we are experiencing right now, actually. So you can imagine it was a very long march, but it was especially a very complicated one, because the French and American troops had to march, first of all, sometimes there were some roads, sometimes they had to make the roads, they had to make different bridges, they had to create encampments every night in order to sleep. And so these encampments had to be created, built, ovens had to be made for food. All the logistics were absolutely impressive, because 9,000 people had to be moved and fed, and they need water too. So this was a logistical operation that was hard to organize in general, but especially because it had to be done very fast, because news had arrived that the French fleet had arrived at the time. So they knew that the French fleet couldn't stay that long. So they needed to arrive at the end of September. If not, the French fleet would leave and they would have totally missed their opportunity to attack the British. And we can talk about all these details later, but the point is, if they would arrive too late, first of all, Cornwallis could have escaped, but also the French fleet could not stay there that long. So if they didn't arrive exactly on time, it would have gone very wrong. Some people call it the Miracle of Yorktown, that they could actually arrive with all these different units at the same time. We're talking about Washington's troops, Rochambeau's troops, that French fleet of Admiral de Grasse, as well as another French fleet of de Barras, who had to come from Newport. And so there's 4 different units that converged at the right time to arrive at the exact same moment in Yorktown, which in the 18th century is very hard logistically, but also in communication, because people had to communicate constantly through letters. So it took weeks for letters to go from one to the other unit. So you have to imagine this really tough organization. And because they worked so well together, and because there was some luck involved, maybe they could make it happen and march as fast as they needed to Yorktown. And another element that needs to be said is the British were aware of the movements, but the French and Americans tried to keep it secret as long as they could that they were marching down. And one of the reasons they would do that is because they were, of course, afraid the British would attack them while marching. But the British were especially prone to sail to Yorktown, or at least Chesapeake Bay, too early. So they needed to make sure it was secret. And they did that in many different ways.
Reality check, though. How can they hide 9,000 men? They're building bridges, ovens, an entire operation. How does something on that scale stay secret?
Of course, it was a plan to keep it secret. It failed very fast because there were a lot of British spies, agents, or loyalists that would obviously see this movement of 9,000 men. You can't hide in a tunnel or something yet. It was out in the open, of course. But the moment that they moved from New York, they were able to conceal their plans for a little bit at least. So for about a few days, they started to make fake encampments, fake bread ovens, create fake boats even, like actually fake ones, just to make General Clinton, who was the British general at Manhattan, he was thinking an attack was imminent at that point because they were creating all these false sort of signals to him. And that is the moment that they actually slipped out. And they kept some units stationed close to New York to make him think they would attack, actually. So for a few days it worked. And of course, after that, it didn't anymore. But then what's interesting is the British commanders started to have some disputes amongst themselves, as well as some rivalries. And so they didn't make decisions fast enough. So they were quite late in responding, which then led to a great advantage for the French-American troops.
Eyewitness accounts of American Revolution soldiers' lives are exceedingly rare, but the VMHC collection contains the diary of Captain Benjamin Bartholomew, which provides a detailed look at daily life and, specifically, the march to Yorktown. His diary, starting on May 19th, 1781, and continuing through March of 1782, details his regiment's march from Pennsylvania to Virginia, mundane military life, and participation in the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. Bartholomew mentions Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, and the arrival of French troops in Virginia.
The important thing to remember is it takes several weeks to go from New York to the Chesapeake Bay region. And so they're marching for about 6 weeks actually down. And so every day is the same rhythm. They march, they make their encampment, they eat, they sleep, and then they march again. So when they arrive mainly in Williamsburg first. So this is the arrival of the French and American troops. And then from September 28, 1781 onwards, they're going to invest the place, how you would call that. So they start to prepare for the siege they're supposed to lay. And so George Washington and Rochambeau have prepared to lay a siege on Yorktown because that's where the troops of Cornwallis are based. They're based in the little town of Yorktown. And so what the French and Americans are doing is they're going to build a lot of entrenchment around the city. And then the idea is to start squeezing Cornwallis in more and more until he will have to surrender.
The strategy was risky, as engaging Cornwallis at Yorktown depended almost entirely on the success of the French fleet in securing the bay.
the most important part of this story is the French fleet. So when the French-American troops are marching for weeks all the way down to Yorktown, well, at the same time, the French fleet of de Grasse is going to arrive from the Caribbean with 24 ships of the line, which are these big battleships. And he also brings many soldiers and sailors extra from other locations to support the troops because the French and Americans still needed more troops. He's entering the Chesapeake Bay on August 30th, 1781, and is going to deliver about 3,000 French soldiers to the mainland. So he has all these ships of the line, which are the big war battleships, and is going to block the bay. So Cornwallis cannot leave, but also the British cannot bring reinforcements. Because from New York, they could have brought their own ships and start something, but they can't because he has blocked it.
On August 30th, 1781, Admiral de Grasse's 24-ship force arrived in the Chesapeake Bay, slipping past the British and landing thousands of French troops in Virginia. Shortly after, on September 5th, the British Navy, led by Rear Admiral Thomas Graves, arrived in the Chesapeake, and an engagement, known as the Battle of the Capes, began. The fight lasted a little more than 2 hours. The ships within closest range exchanged cannon fire, but some remained too far back to be actively engaged. The two fleets stopped firing around dusk. Several hundred sailors were wounded or killed, but no ships were sunk or taken, although some were severely damaged. The VMHC has a series of maps by a French naval officer that illustrates the actions of the French fleet. They depict ship positions before and during engagements with the British Navy, including details about damaged ships, with one British vessel labeled the Terrible, covered in flames. Soon, French naval reinforcements arrived, and although no ships were captured or sunk, the British eventually retreated to New York, rather than challenge the reinforced French fleet.
September 5th was a very important moment where de Grasse took hold of the Chesapeake Bay. And then what is quite interesting is that Rochambeau and Washington were still marching down their troops. So they were not there. As soon as the news of the arrival of de Grasse, and especially the fact he blocked the bay, was received by George Washington, who was en route down there was so much more hope, because it was a moment of great insecurity for those that were marching, because they were not updated like we would be today. Letters had to arrive. And so this took about 10 days to reach George Washington while he was marching. And so it's all about the coordination between the land and the naval troops.
Cornwallis's army was stranded. The French remained in control of the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off Cornwallis from reinforcements and supplies by sea, while allowing Washington and his allies to move troops and equipment into position. Washington's army and Rochambeau's French forces arrived at Yorktown by September 28, 1781, and began preparing for the siege. Soldiers went to work digging extensive fortifications and positions for their artillery, known as batteries, as they advanced towards the British lines, squeezing Cornwallis in more and more as they went.
So there's many first-hand accounts on the Battle of Yorktown. The ones, of course, from François de Chastellux I studied most, but then there is, I say, about a dozen others that are quite known to historians as well, that describe every single day of the march, as well as Battle of Yorktown and Siege of Yorktown. I would say one of the more sort of surprising moments is that Chastellux is, as a major general, very involved in both the strategic planning, logistics, and even the attacks themselves. And he has several moments that he, for instance, describes when British ships are being burned by the British to sort of block a particular part of a waterway. And he is describing that fire as the most beautiful fire he had ever seen. All these British ships burning in front of him. He found more beautiful than a fireworks show, sort of thing, he said, he wrote in his journal. There's also a lot of moments where he is explaining how tired he is, because we're talking about almost, 2.5, 3 weeks of attacks, bombardments, not sleeping. The officers are never sleeping because they have to continuously operate. And so he said he literally almost didn't sleep during this entire period. And he's complaining mainly to his sister how tired he is during this moment. And then there's also a lot of interesting other little insights that you can read in the different journals on how the different attacks went, but also how they had to reorganize themselves very often, how it all went.
In a letter dated October 5th from the VMHC's collection, one man wrote, "I gladly embrace the opportunity of informing you that our whole army is now within cannon shot of the British fortifications. The siege has not begun yet, but with all possible speed they are preparing. Expect we will begin in 10 or 15 days." It didn't even take 10 days. The next day, on October 6th, American and French forces formed a semicircle outside of the town and began an artillery bombardment. There's even a shell fragment in the VMHC's collection purported to be from one of Washington's troops' guns during the siege. For 9 days, the Allied artillery relentlessly bombarded British positions, inching closer and closer to the British stronghold. On the night of October 14th, 1781, one of the most famous blows to Cornwallis's position was dealt. French soldiers and American soldiers stormed Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10.
For listeners, it might be hard to understand, but it's like sort of an earthen wall with spikes coming out. That's what a redoubt was. It's a protective earthwork. And so storming that was, you had to literally run up and then down and just being attacked and kill people just who were there. And so there's descriptions of fist fights, bayonets. Like, it was a really fierce and absolutely violent moment. And often we might, think of Yorktown as sort of almost a romantic battle where people just win. But it's, of course, a very bloody war, and many people died, many people were attacked. And it was almost it was a very physical attack as well for those people involved. And that's something you can also read in these journals of that description of these particular moments in the battle that were just so violent. One of the more surprising things I found recently was also an unpublished archive, another major general called the Baron de Vieux-Mesnil, and he is writing a lot about the attacks on the redoubts 9 and 10, which is a famous moment when Hamilton and Lafayette will storm number 10 and then the French will storm number 9. And so what is interesting about that moment is that what is not known is that Rochambeau himself, the general, was very sick. And so in Vieux-Mesnil's papers, because he was the second in command of this entire operation, because Rochambeau was so sick during that particular day that the command went to Vieux-Mesnil. It had to stay very secret, though, because if anyone would know, the morale of all the troops, knowing your general is sick, is not good. And so Vieux-Mesnil took over, but also wrote letters to Lafayette, to Hamilton, to von Steuben, to many others, with very clear instructions on, we're going to attack redoubt number 9 and redoubt number 10, and this is how it will go. Here are the signals, here are all the instructions. Rochambeau approves it, Washington approves it, but the actual commander of that day is not Rochambeau, like people thought, or an initiative of maybe Hamilton and Lafayette. It's actually Vieux-Mesnil behind it that made that decision to attack them.
The attack was over almost as quickly as it began. In just 30 minutes, the troops captured both redoubts using only sabers and bayonets. A letter in the VMHC's collection, dated October 15th, describes the capture of the redoubts, stating, "A little after 7 o'clock, an attack was made by the French grenadiers and the American light infantry on the enemy's 2 left redoubts below the town. In 10 minutes, they were both in our possession without our firing a shot. The enemy blazed away very furiously, not only from these redoubts, but their whole line. We made about 70 prisoners, and it is supposed about 30 were bayoneted. The acquisition of these 2 places not only brings us into closer neighborhood with the enemy, but puts us on a level with them with respect to ground. A few days more will, I hope, close the scene and enable us to look at each other in triumph from York and Gloucester points. I most heartily rejoice with you on the brightening prospects and am your friend, Robert Andrews." Brightening prospects for who? The loss of redoubts 9 and 10 made it clear to Cornwallis that Yorktown could no longer be defended. British forces made one last attempt to escape on the night of October 16th by crossing the York River to Gloucester Point. Nature, however, had other plans. A powerful windstorm scattered the boats and forced the evacuation to be abandoned. On October 19th, 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered his army.
He is being completely crushed. He is totally outnumbered by the French and American troops. That navy that is blocking, he has to surrender. There's no way he could get out of that. And for him personally, it's a very humiliating surrender.
In fact, Cornwallis skipped the surrender ceremony, citing illness, and sent his second in command in his place to hand over the British army.
Well, there's a famous moment during the surrender where Cornwallis himself is not there. He is supposedly sick, and then there's other figures. So his other generals are going to have to give the surrender sword. And this is a famous episode, of course, but it's where the British will want to give the surrender sword to Rochambeau, the French general, because it's easier for them to have to admit they lost from a French army than to an American army. Then Rochambeau says, no, it should be Washington that receives this.
In response, Washington had his own second in command accept it instead, becoming both an exchange of surrender terms and a little pettiness.
But the point is, it's really hard for the British to have to admit they lost from the American army, because it's, in their opinion, still this ragtag army, disorganized. And here, Cornwallis, who is one of the most famous generals of his time, has to admit he has lost from the American army. And for him, that is very hard to swallow. And so I think it's nothing about that he was instructed to do this, or that it was like, oh, the end of the war is near. For them, it was, they were still in the middle of the war. A lot of other campaigns would have still happened. But for him personally, it must have been a tough one.
9 days after the surrender, Cornwallis signed a parole document that allowed him to return to Great Britain on the condition that he not fight against the United States again. His army, however, remained prisoners of war until they were exchanged or paroled.
And then also there's descriptions after the battle, when the surrender had happened, that there were so many corpses laying around, dead horses, dead people. Even in Yorktown itself, a lot of wounded people were sort of just walking, roaming around. There's descriptions from some French journals that also indicate that especially the black soldiers were left on their own to die. They were not brought to hospitals, or at least later than other soldiers. And so there's also very heartbreaking descriptions of how the Black Americans that served, especially in the Continental Army, were quite mistreated, as well as the British soldiers. So African-American soldiers on both sides, both on the British and the American Army, were just left on their own on these fields.
Now, it may have taken weeks to move 9,000 men from the northern states to Virginia, but news of the surrender traveled fast. Cornwallis's surrender was secured on October 19th, and less than 1 week later, news was already in Rhode Island, as evidenced by a broadside in the VMHC's collection that was printed in Providence around 3 p.m. on October 25th, 1781, just 1 day after receiving the news from Virginia. The broadside celebrates the victory at Yorktown, proclaiming, "By this glorious conquest, 9,000 of the enemy, including seamen, fell into our hands." While the surrender was certainly celebrated, it wasn't clear at the time that this would actually be the beginning of the end.
So the surrender happened, and of course, the French and American troops were very excited that they won a battle, but for none of these people involved, it was supposed to be the final battle. They were not aware at all that it would become that much of a turning point. One of the reasons is that they were already planning their next move. They had abandoned the idea of attacking New York City, which was the stronghold of Great Britain. What George Washington said at one point is, we will not deliver the final blow if it's not against New York. So New York was the only place where it would really strike the heart of the British 13 colonies, if so. So they were just convinced they had to go further again. Yorktown was a little step with a little victory that then might lead to another victory and then maybe something else. But so they could really not see the end of the war here.
To many Virginians, the American Revolution ends in 1781 at Yorktown. And while it is the last major battle of the war itself does technically continue for 2 more years.
The end of the war also is not really Yorktown. It's more that it's a moment where the British start to realize this war is getting too long and way too costly. And here we just lost. But what is the next step? There is almost no hope for us to win this unless we start to invest so much more, and probably one day we'll lose it anyway. So this is not technically the end of the war, but it is in a way the end of the fighting between these two armies on larger scales. There are some smaller scales, things happening still, and some plans that will be abandoned. But I think the reason it became such a important turning point is that, first of all, Cornwallis was defeated by George Washington and his allies. That is an important symbolic moment, but it's also when Lord North, when he heard about it, and George III, the king, there was this famous phrase, "Oh, it's all over now. It's all over. We cannot do this." So it's really a tipping point where the British realize if we continue this war, it's not going to work for us. And so it is the end in that way, but very literally it's not the end, because the actual end is another battle. There's another battle in India, which would be the actual last battle. But these are all quite like lesser of an impact, and also it becomes a symbolic end of this war at that point.
On September 3rd, 1783, the Revolutionary War officially came to an end with the Treaty of Paris between the United States and Great Britain. The treaty recognized the United States as an independent nation and established its new borders, stretching west to the Mississippi River. And so the American experiment begins. One exciting thing about this podcast is learning that there are still unexplored archives, new stories, new perspectives, and new old pages to turn. Dr. de Rhodes' research proves it. So let's finish out the story of Chastellux.
Yeah, so after the war, well, especially after Yorktown, they spent quite a lot of time together, so they grow even closer. But then there's a dramatic day in November 1782 where they have to say farewell because Chastellux has to go home, and that's the end of their at least physical presence together. And so Chastellux comes to his home in New York. It's called Newburgh encampment, so he's in that Newburgh home. So they spend 3 days together to reminisce about the past times and probably the future as well. And so they have a lot of fun. They apparently go on a squirrel hunt, which was quite a surprising activity. But they also have a lot of dinners. They stay inside quite a lot next to the fireplace and just have conversations. And so as soon as Chastellux really has to leave, apparently Washington couldn't find the words. He was silent. And then he writes to Chastellux a few days after that, say like, "I couldn't find words the moment you departed, so I'm going to express myself in a letter." And that is when he says that their friendship can never be eradicated by time nor distance. And that's also the moment he tells him about the fact his soul claves more to his soul than anyone else. So Chastellux' soul and Washington's were very intertwined and glued together. And so from that moment onwards, there is quite a large correspondence between the two. So when Chastellux came back to France, he received letters from Washington. He received these little trees that I spoke about. He also received a big portrait of George Washington. And on the frame, it said, "From Washington to Chastellux." And so Chastellux kept that very dear and put it on above his own mantle. And it's still owned by the family. Or no, that's not true. It's been sold recently, but they have a copy of that Washington portrait. And so they stayed in correspondence for several years up until 1788 when Chastellux died. And so the last letter between them is about the Constitutional Convention, actually. So George Washington is sharing what is happening in the United States, and Chastellux is very interested in that topic.
Even if Chastellux' archive hadn't sat undisturbed for centuries, his work for the Revolution may not have become a major part of his legacy.
So there's several reasons for Chastellux' oblivion, and the first one would be that his archives were inaccessible to historians. That's an obvious explanation why he got forgotten. Another one is that he was not like Lafayette himself or Rochambeau that would publish their memoirs. He died very unexpectedly and he never had time to do so. And I'm not sure he would have either, because he writes very often that he didn't want to be famous. He didn't want to be remembered for the heroic deeds he did. He only wanted to be remembered as a friend of Voltaire, as a philosopher. That was his main goal in life. So whatever he did in his military career, he did not really want people to remember him for, because he considered that just his duty and not his own sort of glorious, achievement. And so it was his own choice in that particular way. He wrote a travel diary that was published in 1786 about his American travels, but he did not include Yorktown in it. While he had so much material on it and of course knew so much about it, he has played such an important role, but he never wrote about it. And so I think for many historians, if you are looking at journals, you're like, Chastellux is not that interesting because he's describing, in my opinion, very interesting things about constitutions of the different states. He describes Jefferson, Washington, Adams, and everyone you can imagine. So he is a very interesting philosopher observing this nascent United States, but he didn't talk about Yorktown. So most military historians that have studied this are like, yeah, well, no one knows what this man did there. And so that is another explanation. And the fourth most sort of larger explanation is those that have been remembered are mainly Lafayette. Some people might know Rochambeau, some people might know de Grasse, but overall, all these other thousands of Frenchmen are really quite forgotten. So Chastellux is one of them. And one of the reasons is that Lafayette took a lot of the, let's call it credit himself at the time, but also sort of history has made him that because he was serving in the Continental Army, not in the French one. So it's maybe a better sort of American version of a story, because what you can see, especially during the 19th century in many history books, during the moment of the westward expansion and nation building, is that the story of a French king creating an American republic didn't really work in that national story. And so the French have been a bit diminished in their role. And so Lafayette was still a great symbol because he was, at least said himself, he was not listening to his king's orders and left France to join the Continental Army and became Washington's son. So he could be that nice French-American symbol. But explaining all the others has been just falling apart a bit. And there are obviously some books, but for the larger audience, people are maybe not that aware of all these other people that were standing behind Lafayette.
So thank you to Dr. Iris de Rode for sharing her research on today's episode. You can learn more about her work, including her upcoming publication about the role of the French in the American Revolution, at irisderode.com. Thanks for joining us this season, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Revolution Revisited. The American Revolution was not an ending, but a beginning. The stories continue to unfold. Subscribe now and catch the next episode for another journey through history. This podcast is made possible by William and Karen Fralin and presented by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture.
Revolution Revisited is a production of the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Our production staff includes Haley Finner, Maggie Creech, Nicole Martirana, and Tracy Schneider. Be sure to subscribe to get notified about upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Explore 16,000 years of Virginia history. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture offers a variety of exhibitions, public programs, and special events for the whole family. Learn more and plan your visit at virginiahistory.org.